Hi, my name is Todd Leonard.
And my name is Herb Montgomery, and we're just talking.
Hey, thanks for taking a moment to click on the like button, to subscribe to our channel, and to click on the bell icon to get reminded of when our presentations drop.
So each week, Todd and I have a conversation about the upcoming lectionary reading for the upcoming weekend from the Gospels. And our goal is to talk about that passage in the context of love and inclusion and societal justice. We also hope that our conversation will be just in the sense of justice, but that something we say as we go back and forth during these next few moments that something this week we say might inspire you to do more than just talking.
So this week we've come to kind of an anomaly in the lectionary where we have a very brief reading from the Gospels, and we're in Matthew 10, verses 40 to 42, and just kind of interesting short little nugget for us to unpack and work through, and hope it will be uh, provide some meaning for you as you prepare for your studies, your presentations this weekend. So Herb, why don't you get us started?
Yeah, so to get our heads around this, anyone who welcomes you welcomes me, and giving, little ones who are my disciple a drink of water. I think we need to go back and look at the context. And so Matthew 10, same chapter, but verses 9 through 14. This is the instructions that Jesus gave to his followers as he was sending them out. He said, don't get any gold or silver or copper to take with you in your belts, no bag for the journey, or extra shirt or sandals or a staff, for the worker is worth his keep. Whatever town or village you enter, search there for some worthy person and stay at their house until you leave. As you enter the home, give it your greeting. If the home is deserving, let your peace rest on it. If it is not, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, leave that home or town and shake the dust off of your feet. So again, there's three different versions of this. The other one's in Mark 6, 8 through 9. The third one is in Luke 9, verse 3, and chapter 10, verse 4. And each version basically agrees with the main thesis here. There's differences in the details, like the staff and things like that. But each version agrees at least that Jesus was sending these followers out as completely dependent upon the hospitality or generosity of those to whom they were going to be ministering to. He was not sending them out as independent, self-sufficient, self-funded workers. They were wholly dependent, kind of just throwing them out there, dependent upon the kindness of those whom they were going to be ministering to or serving. So there's a lot there to kind of unpack. He was setting them up intentionally for dependence rather than independence
Yeah,
or self reliance.
yeah, it's a pretty interesting concept when you think about it, and one that then when you come into this passage of 40 through 42, then he turns to the those who would be receiving the disciples, and helping them prepare to be hospitable, and that whole mutuality process. Very interesting, very much not in the vein of how we would operate today and how our society operates in the West. This would not happen at all. This is you do everything you can not to be a burden on the other. You do everything you can to not look weak, to not look dependent. Everything you can, you try to avoid that at all costs. So it is interesting that Jesus is setting up a mutual dependency.
Yeah, I mean, from a very young age in our system, we're 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 taught to take care of yourself and don't depend on anyone else to take care of you. And some people succeed at that game, and a lot of people don't. But it runs contrary, at least against the grain of what we're
Hmm.
commonly taught. Todd, I have a statement from Stephen Patterson from his book The Lost Way: Two Forgotten Gospels Are Rewriting the Story. The Two Forgotten Gospels Are Rewriting the Story of the Christian Origins, that I think sheds some light on this. I'm going to share my screen real quick and see if we can't dive into just a little bit of commentary on this. Did that come up?
Yep.
Right there it is. My computer's a little slow on my side. This is page 74, 75. He says it begins with a knock on the door, on the stoop. And I love the imagery here. That's why I wanted to share it the way that it's described. On the stoop stand two itinerant beggars with no purse, no knapsack, no shoes, no staff. I mean, that's quite an image. They're barefoot even.
Mm-hmm.
They are so ill-equipped that they must cast their fate before the feet of a would-be host. This is a point often made by historical Jesus scholar John Dominic Crossan. These Q folk are sort of like ancient cynics, but their goal is not the cynic goal of self sufficiency. These itinerants are set for dependency. To survive, they must reach out to other human beings. They offer, let me see if I can pull this back up here so I can read it. They offer them peace, and this is how the empire of God is consummated. Oh, I'm sorry. This is how the empire of God arrives. If their peace is accepted, they eat and drink. This is how the empire of God is consummated in table fellowship. Then another tradition is tacked on, beginning with the words, whenever you enter a town. This is perhaps the older part of the tradition, for this and only this also has a parallel in the Gospel of Thomas, and there's an echo of it in Paul's letter known as First Corinthians. Here, as in the first tradition, the itinerants are instructed to eat what is set before you. Again, the first move is to ask. The empire of God comes when someone receives food from another, then something is offered in return. Care for the sick. The empire of God here involves an exchange, food for care. So again, it's kind of that setting them up to be dependent. And the reality is, I mean, Todd, this is not, I mean, in our independence and our self-reliance, we're, even though that's how we're culturally taught, there's a sense in which that goes against not just this, but reality. I mean, in
Mm-hmm.
reality, we are all connected, whether we like it or not. We're all part of one another. Where, what affects one affects us all. Like King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Lewis, her statement, Reverend Lewis, about if there is such a thing as societal salvation, no one is saved unless we're all saved. There's this interconnectedness that is the reality of how life works, and we kind of live in denial of that in the West in our practice.
Yep. That's true. We do. It is so contrary.
Yeah. So this statement, it continues on. There's a little bit more here. See if I can pull up the next portion of it. I don't know if I can. There it is. This warrants pause. Food for care. In the ancient world, see if I can move this out of the way. Our heads keep getting in the way of the text. So those who lived in the ancient world, those who lived on the margins of the peasant life were never far from death's door. In the struggle to survive, food was their friend and sickness their enemy. Each day, subsistence peasants earn enough to eat for a day. Each day they awaken with the question, will I earn enough to eat today? And this is quickly followed by a second. Will I get sick today? If I get sick, I won't eat. And if I don't eat, I'll get sicker. With each passing day, the spiral of starvation and sickness becomes deeper and deeper and finally deadly. Crossan has argued that this little snippet of the ancient tradition is critical to understanding why the followers of Jesus and their empire of God were compelling to the marginalized peasants who were drawn to it. Eat what is set before you and care for the sick. Here is the beginning of a program of shared resources of the most basic sort, food and care. It's an exchange. If some have food, all will eat. If any get sick, someone who eats will be there to care for them. The empire of God was a way to survive, which is to say, salvation. And I know that's more
Mm,
of a social definition of salvation there. And two, I'm reminded of, the idea that civilization is marked as when the beginning of civilization is marked when it was found that a femur bone was mended among the
mhm,
hunter gatherers. And I think about, in our system, again, today we live in one of the most wealthy countries in the world, and yet the wealth disparity between the haves, the gap between the haves and the have
mhm,
nots, is so huge because we're so independent. I remember I was actually preaching at your church once, Todd. This was years ago, and someone came up to me, and it was on the, if anyone has, sell their possessions and give them to the poor. If anyone has superfluous wealth, to redistribute that to those who don't have. And talking about Acts and Acts 2 and Acts 4, where the early church did that. And someone came
mhm,
up to me afterwards and said, well, does that mean that I should get rid of my retirement account? And for
mm,
crying out loud, no, I don't think it
right.
means that at all. But what it does mean is that we have built such an isolated system, a privatized kind of these silos, where everybody is kind of, they've taken care of themselves, sometimes at the expense of others, but they've at least taken care of themselves to where they're not dependent on anyone else for their survival. And that's what a retirement account is to a degree. I mean, if you look
Mhm,
at the real nuts and bolts, there's a lot more going on there that's interconnected than what this conversation warrants. But at the same time, um, it's a way for people to survive on their own in their later years. And the solution, the movement is not get rid of your retirement accounts, because we don't live in a world where we're taking care of each other. The
right.
call then is to begin creating a world where it's based on cooperation rather than competition, where we're taking care of one another rather than competing with one another and trying to get all the time, where we're building community, where we take responsibility to make sure everybody's taken care of. And if we would lean into that, I would think eventually, maybe not in our lifetime, but eventually at some point, retirement accounts will become obsolete. We create a
Mhm,
community
mhm,
where those in their later years of life are taken care of by the community.
right.
Um, so what I'm saying. So the solution really isn't sell your retirement account. My point is the solution is build community. We should be building communities where we aren't so pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, but we actually become intentional about making sure everyone in the community is taken care of and no one has too much while others don't have enough.
Right. Yeah, I think we have to, in some ways, we have to recontextualize this passage a little bit, just to get the principle of it, but then recontextualize it to today, because we aren't in the same system that we were before. That, but at the heart, the issue is, like you said, it's community. It
Mhm.
is it is really being together and looking after one another and making sure that all our needs met, monetarily and otherwise. There's a lot to say about people's health well-being based upon the strength of community.
Mhm.
Honestly, our health costs would go down if we were if elderly especially weren't so isolated from one another and weren't so lonely. Health costs would go down if there was stronger community, stronger care for those in need, um, than than how things are today, where everybody is expected to function independently on their own. This is we are we are set up for problems down the road because we are not in community now. That it's Well, I don't know if I have anything else I can add to that, but I think
Yeah, I
it's,
think I think there are countries out there, that don't sacrifice freedom and democracy and all those things that are such high values in America, or at least the rhetoric of
mhm,
democracy is a high value in America. Sometimes the practice, I think, could be a lot better. But the idea of democracy is so bedrock to Americanism. There are countries out there that have very like incredibly strong democracies, but their systems are very social rather than
mhm,
individual. They're making sure that you have your private life, but then you have your civic public, social responsibilities where you make sure, and they do it well. I'm thinking
yeah,
of some European countries that really do, what we're describing this week. Their health systems, their retirement, their work life, their
mhm,
recreational life, all of that is just handled so much better because it's not about making, the goal is not to make individuals stupidly wealthy.
right,
The goal is to make sure everybody's taken care of, that we take
right.
responsibility for our neighbor, we love our neighbor as ourself.
And that is as much about structuring things so that people actually have time
Yeah,
to
yeah.
invest socially uh, and and governmentally and as citizens invest their time in actually having having enough free time where they can invest in caring for
Mm-hmm.
the people around them and building strong neighborhoods and things like that. Um, that has to be part of that balance. When you're asking people to work 50, 60 hours a week in order to make ends meet,
Right.
you don't have the luxury of time to care for your own family members, let alone caring
Your
for others in your
community.
neighborhood. Right.
Right. Right. Right. And if we go back to the early church, not everybody in the early church agreed with this. There was debate back there too. Not all of them practiced this. I would say, according to the best of our knowledge, the evidence that we have, the majority of them did early on. But you
Mm-hmm.
have outliers like Paul in First Corinthians. Paul goes on that tirade of, doesn't everybody deserve the tithe? And yet I, never took anything from you. God forbid Paul would be dependent on those he was ministering to. He
Mm-hmm.
did the exact opposite and bragged about it. But even in that passage, for those of you who want the passage, 1 Corinthians 9, but even in that passage, you can see he's saying everybody else does this, I do this. He's confessing that his practice is an outlier in the early Jesus community, that he's
Mm-hmm.
not following the practice that the community traced back to the teachings of Jesus. And you can see it in the Didache too. I mean, the Didache, there must have been people abusing this by the time that was written, because people are like, if someone stays with you more than 3 days, you need to question whether they're, a false prophet. And if they go on to
Interesting.
the next town, they can take bread with them. But if they ask you for money, they're a false prophet. There was all
Yeah.
these qualifiers there. So again, the early church didn't have it all right. They were a mixed bag too. But again, we get this kernel in this week's lectionary reading. We get this kernel of Jesus encouraging his followers at the bedrock to practice what they preach, to go out
Mm-hmm.
and to intentionally create communities of interdependence and interconnectedness with one another, where the reality is we are dependent on one another for our survival. Whether we like that idea or not, that's universal truth. That's reality. That's how we're structured as the human race.
Yeah.
And I think the reading this week calls us to lean into that and begin fostering communities where we're intentionally um, um, just aware of that, connected to that, practicing in heart, living in harmony with that.
Mm. And to put in a plug for church, church
Yeah,
can
sure.
be that. Church can be, if you're intentional about it, can become a means of practicing some of that community by, if the church intentionally will set aside a portion of the money that is brought into it to actually set it aside to help care for one another, to be there to support. Mormon congregations are notoriously, and notorious is the wrong word. They're rightly honored for what they do when they have members in their community who are in need. That Mormon, that local congregational community will step in and make sure that family is taken care of. If somebody's lost a job, they will make sure that family's taken care of until somebody's found a job again.
Yeah.
That it's powerful, and so there is the ability that if you engage in that intentionally as a church, you could actually have micro communities, microeconomic communities that could really support people in their times of need. Too
And
often,
that
though, it just that doesn't happen, and the churches invest all their money in programming and things like that, and there's not anything set aside. But the ability is there if you
or the
were to take it
facility is so
seriously, and
expensive.
the facility, right?
Right.
That's true too.
Yeah. But I heard someone recently or just this week refer to church as the Jesus store. In our capitalist society, they're going to the
Yeah,
Jesus store, right? So
yeah,
so this would be a very different way of doing church, where church is that practicing of community.
yeah.
And that would be very attractive. It would attract. Being a part of a church like that would become attractive to, I would think, the same demographic, the same social location as the early church, because again, this would be another form of salvation, another form of survival of people surviving in our present system.
And again, if we're understanding church as about building a just church's mission, if the gospel of Jesus is about building a just, equitable society, then that's where the church should be focused on, because those are the people who are not getting the benefits of society that the rest of us who are in the middle and upper class have.
And I would
We
hope too that we can start shaping while we're doing that, kind of like as a church, a community within the larger community, that as we're doing that we can actually be engaged societally as well, to where we create systems where what we're doing at church becomes obsolete,
right, absolutely, yeah.
where it's no longer
This
charity.
becomes right. It's just it was needed for a time, but then functionally, the influence, people seeing what the church did to and how it transformed things, then broader society catches on and runs with that,
Mm-hmm.
and then less and less, because ultimately, when you do look at the economic divide, no one congregation, not even a denomination of churches on their own, can solve that economic divide. It can have an impact in local communities for a certain amount of people. It really you really hope what happens ultimately is churches influence broader societies, so where government ultimately recognizes that it's something that it needs to take on.
Yeah,
Uh,
that reminds me of the early church. I mean, the two things that Rome complained about Christians about, um, if you read the early church fathers, was that number one, they were pacifists, so they would never, support the Roman military, and that was a. But the other one is that they take care of their poor better than Rome does.
hmm, wow.
That was the critique: is that they are doing a better job at societal taking care of those on the margins than society is. And man,
Wow.
what a difference today.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I
Wow.
have one more statement, if you don't mind. One more
Yeah.
statement from this one's from James Robinson, and it's his book, The Gospel of Jesus. James Robinson is another historical Jesus scholar. But I remember years ago reading this statement, and it really challenged me at that time to question whether or not I was um, teaching the same thing Jesus taught in the stories, at least, or whether I was preaching a gospel about Jesus. And it's just I think contextually, it's a great quote for what we're looking at this week. It says, this is again from the Gospel of Jesus, James Robinson. Jesus's basic issue, still basic today, is that most people have solved the human dilemma for themselves at the expense of everyone else, putting them
Mm,
down so as to stay afloat themselves. This vicious antisocial, and I would love to be accused of being a socialist on moments like this, but this vicious antisocial way of coping with the necessities of life only escalates the dilemma for the rest of society. I am hungry because you hoard food. You are cold because I'm hoarding clothing. Our dilemma is that we all hoard supplies in our backpacks and put our trust in our wallets. Such security should be replaced by God reigning. And this is what he means
Mm.
by this. This is not religious rhetoric, which means both what I trust God to do to activate you to share food with me and what I hear God telling me to do to share clothes with you. We should not carry money while bypassing the poor or wear a backpack with extra clothes and food while ignoring the cold and hungry lying in the gutter. This is why the beggars, the hungry, the depressed are fortunate. God, that is, those in whom God rules, those who hearken to God will care for them. The needy are called upon to trust that God's reigning is there for them. Theirs is the kingdom of God. Jesus' message was simple. He wanted to cut straight through to the point. Trust God to look out for you by providing people that will care for you, and listen to him where he calls on you to provide for them. So there's a principle here too that, and it's in our reading, that our lectionary reading this week too. The kernel of it is that we have hoarded our resources to so that we can be able to survive in the future, a future rainy day, so to speak. In West Virginia legislature here in our state, we have what's called a rainy day fund in our government budget item. But again, we kind of do that on a personal level too. We save up this money for emergencies. But and I'm not disparaging that. Of course, you should do that, especially within the system that we're in today. But what if we created a system where we're creating the kind of community whereby in me taking care of what someone else has, so a need that someone has today, what I'm doing is I'm creating the kind of community in that moment where hopefully in the future, if I have a need, there will be someone to provide for me then too. I'm the solution today in the hopes that if I come into need in the future, I won't be depending on, my hoarded resources. I'm dependent
Mm.
on the community that I belong to, that I'm feeding into, that now it's my turn to be taken care of in the same way that
Mhm.
I've taken care of others in the past. And that's what Paul, as much as I bag on Paul at times, Paul does talk about in Corinthians that it's not for their abundance at our scarcity that we're giving to them in their time of need in hopes that they'll give to us in our time of need. And he says it right there. The goal is equality. The goal is
Mm.
that we're all taken care of. And I love that it's not pie in the sky, trusting in God for miracles. It's intensely practical. It's concrete. It's boots on the ground. I'm
Yep.
taking care of people today, creating community with the hope, with the trust that the kind of community I'm creating is that at the point in the future, this stuff that I've let go of that I could use to take care of me later, the fact that I'm using that to take care of someone today is setting in motion the kind of community that if I do have a need tomorrow, someone's got my back the way that I've had their back today.
Mm.
And that would
Mhm.
be a beautiful community if it worked that way.
Yeah. Well, and I just find it interesting that the way that Jesus comes, how he advises this to unfold is he asks those who are the messengers of the gospel to come as the one in need,
Yeah.
not to come as the one to give everything, but
Yeah.
to the one to come in need. And so the idea that those of us who are in the position now where we have the ability to show hospitality, there is still, I think, real relevance in honoring a person who may be in a lower social strata or a lower economic strata than us, um, being able to come in as one who shows that person that you need them,
Mm,
that
I
that
love
that
that.
they are necessary to your well-being, not because they have more stuff or more resources, but that because they are inherently valuable as a brother or sister in God's kingdom. And therefore they matter to you, and their friendship matters to you enough where you come to them as someone who gives them the opportunity to show you hospitality in a way that they're able to.
That's right.
and and
It's
and then that opens opportunities for a mutuality where then maybe in return. But so often we engage in so much, those of us who are at the upper levels, uh, we we condescend and say, how
mm.
can we, and it becomes a very transactional process of giving acts of mercy, but not honoring the inherent humanity and dignity of the people that we're serving. It's kind of like we're elevating ourselves in the process of giving food to the hungry or clothes to the naked, rather than coming alongside and bowing before them uh, as our brother, as our sister,
Mhm.
as our loved one.
Yeah, it's in honoring and valuing their humanity as in doing that we reclaim our own humanity. We get in touch with
Yeah.
our own humanity. So absolutely. And the last thing we want to encourage is white saviorism, where the
Right.
rich are being what we're talking about is not setting up, and Christians are so good at charity, so awful at justice. We're not talking about setting up another system of charity. We're talking about creating a system of mutuality which begins by having the humility within those who have worked so hard to be independent and self-sufficient. It first comes in challenging them to show up as wholly dependent on another human being.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's powerful to me.
Yeah.
Because the
Yeah.
last thing I want to do is show in the way that I would, have been enculturated. The last thing I want to do is show dependence or weakness.
Right. Yeah. It's going. You have to go against that, and and that's absolutely essential to any inequality that exists. Is the person who's benefited from privilege, benefited from the power structure. Your calling is to first recognize ultimately how you have been harmed
Mm,
by that, by benefiting from the power structure, how you've been harmed from being the privileged person because you have missed out on the benefits of somebody from a minority race, a minority culture, a minority economic position. You have missed out. You,
your
the person in
humanity is,
power,
yeah.
you are the one in poverty.
Mm,
You are the one in poverty because you have missed out on all the blessings of God that exist in the marginalized people groups.
mm.
You've missed out.
Yeah, it's the different. It's yeah, yeah. I need to chew on that more because there's a difference in inviting people to come sit at your table and realizing that God's already sitting at theirs.
Right.
That imagery of, yeah. And again, it's charity versus justice. It's about establishing a just world where we're not showing up as the generous charitable saviors, but going there wholly. I just love that, having the humility to show up as barefoot beggars, wholly dependent on someone else's doorstep.
Yeah. It's radical.
Well, that's a lot for me to chew on this week, Todd.
No,
It's easy for me to give, it's harder for me to receive. I'm just going to be honest.
absolutely. Absolutely.
And here Jesus is calling his first disciples to go out in receptive mode, not giving mode,
Yep. Yeah.
dependent mode. Yeah. All right.
Recognize what you have been missing in the other.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah. Yeah.
much
God is
there.
already at work in those on the margins, the recognize in the communities on the margins. The call is not to invite them to your table, but to see that God is at work there, and answer the question, what are you going to do with it?
Yep. Yep.
What are you going to do in relation to that?
Yep.
And that doesn't
Yep.
mean we barge into their table and take over like good colonialists. Man,
Yeah,
there's
we
there's just
sit as a
so many
guest. We
ways.
sit as a guest. Yeah, there's so many
Yeah.
ways that we can keep corrupting
Yes.
what Jesus is trying to do.
There's so many ways that we can find the loophole and short circuit it all. Oh, I feel like I need guardrails.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
All
All right,
right. Well,
man.
that's what I got this week. You got anything else,
Okay.
Todd?
Nah, I'm good. I'm
All
full.
right. Where can people find you?
ToddJLeonard.com or at my church, GlendaleCityChurch.org. And how about you?
You can find me at renewedheartministries.com.
All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We'll look forward to joining you again next week.
Have a great week, everyone.